So let's have this discussion because it's really interesting, and we don't have to talk about the rest of it. I've talked about enough. I'll show you videos. The clinical implications of this are potentially very broad, right? So I'm going to break this down a little bit into stroke and its related outcomes, cerebral palsy and its related outcomes, ALS and TBI and traumatic brain injury and things like that. So it's stroke. Aphasia. This is a language disorder. It's not a motor disorder. So we have to tap into the neurological network at the level of the disorder, right? And figure out a way to overcome the impairment as a result of the neurological trauma. So what I've talked about is strictly motor. And so that's one of the things that I did sort of introduce. I think I introduced it right before you got in here, is that there is a separation between motor representations for speech and language representations of your intended communication. Right. And in aphasia, the language, well, it's not even the language, in inferior frontal aphasia, so Broca's aphasia, the expressive aphasia, there's an inability to transform intended linguistic outputs into motor commands. And so somewhere in that process, there's a disruption, and we think it's happening in an area that we know a lot about, and this is an area that we think holds the key to those abstract to phonological representations, so this abstract to motor.
So it's not a loss of language per se, it's a loss of motor expression of the language. Is that what you're saying?
In between those two things.
Oh.
And it is comorbid with everything else.
You're right.
Right, so there is usually no just straight up aphasia. It's usually in addition to apraxia or ataxia. These are disorders of the cerebellum and primary motor cortex. So in apraxia of speech, you do have damage of not just the formation of that plan, but the transmission of that plan to motor cortex, right? And then ALS is the destruction of the motor areas themselves with everything else being spared. So you can see how these different disorders end up forming a hierarchy of, is it language, is it motor transmission, is it motor itself? Cerebral palsy is a very interesting case because there is movement. And in some cases of cerebral palsy, the effects are fairly mild and don't contribute too much to speech intelligibility, but in other cases very, very severe and can be considered almost a functional paralysis. The muscles work, but there is such spasticity that the muscles are rigid, the effectors are rigid, and the musculature can't be used for communication. Unfortunately, that's, even though that would be the best next step for me, because it ends up being one of these almost paralyzed scenarios, right. The motor artifact is a killer because we can't get past that through all of that spasticity in the musculature. So additional techniques are needed to separate those things.
But what you were saying, because I still remember my mother, she had such incredible reception,
Right,
she had been
right.
a poetry writer all her life and a big user of language.
Right.
For me, it was interesting that even with some use of music and singing, suddenly she would come up with some lines. So that, but you're saying at some point they probably would utilize it because your level of stroke can be so varied also.
Sure,
and then she had absolutely no word ability at all, too, so it was like...
Motor ability.
Yeah.
Yeah, she had motor but no words,
Right.
So to me it was enormous. And I just wanted to point this out at the time to just the range of speech pathologists you'd bumped into because she had the stroke up in Wisconsin, and I just brought her to my house here in Kansas, and whoever came through with the visiting nurses even just wanted to say, we think she has no reception at all and all this other stuff. And to me it was so, I could see she could, and so I was so happy to get someone from KU to come down, and at that point it sounded like there was just a small computer at least where, even how frustrating that is, that you can even just press, I want a drink of water and stuff like that, because she certainly, I came to, because I had nonverbal children at the time, I was really able to understand what she wanted often, because I was used to interacting with them, too, but again, and I want you to go on, but it's like, at some point, and then what you're saying with aphasia and that kind of speech loss, there can be such a range of it. It might not always be successful though either, though that's
Right, right. And so this idea that reception is spared is sort of critical as well. You have to be able to understand the instructions. So if your mother was not able to understand the language, then understanding that you could press something to communicate for you would not have been received.
Yeah, she
right?
really could though.
Exactly.
That's, I mean, she really could on a high level,
No.
you know, she was watching really complicated TV shows and actually following them, you know, and stuff like that. And if I asked her to go do something, she would go do it. She'd roll around and do it, you know, so that's what I meant. So if you're like that, there's a chance, and she had the use of her left hand, you know, and so whatever they had at that time, I'm just sorry I didn't rush ahead and get it, because she could have at least started pressing, you know, certain statements that would help her from being frustrated too, like I need to go to the bathroom or whatever, you know, but.
So is your application of this material to the ALS patient, is that subject chosen because she represents the best place for you to test the computer brain interface when there's like almost total paralysis?
That's right. So
Yeah.
we're in situations where
there's lots of noise going on.
that's exactly right. So this is almost, you know, as a person who's interested in clinical matters, we think of the patient first and things, but as an engineer, it's also a test bed, right? So it's a very difficult thing to reconcile sometimes, but these disorders end up being, if you have the right one, and it's always difficult to think about it in that way too, like just the right disorder. But you can actually truly evaluate the performance of the technique so that you can then go back and work with somebody who has excellent reception and could operate a device, work with somebody who maybe has motor output, but it is so slurred and dysarthric that maybe we can do something else to help filter that out through brain activity, through muscular activity, to come up with a better communicative output.
Amazing, amazing.
That's essentially what we're doing. I could stop there. I've got like 10 more slides and I've slowed down. So
one more step.
Sure.
Take this goes well beyond both experimental and clinical, but take a big step into what's your thoughts about the future, like
Yeah.
35 or 40 years down the line.
I'm glad you said 30, 40 because so 10 years ago I was asked, in 5 years where will we be? And I was and my advisor and I thought, well, we'd have consonants by now, surely. And 5 years came and went, and we didn't have consonants. And so then I was involved in another paper where part of it was describing what are going to be the 5-year outcomes of this. And I said, surely we'll have consonants by then. And we still don't. So the short time scales of this are rather variable. Where some of the biggest promise comes from, and this is some of the more challenging aspects of this work, is through implanted devices. And I've been fortunate to work with people who have are in the hospital for pre-surgical monitoring for resection of brain tissue due to epilepsy. And so they are in the hospital, they are being monitored with electrodes that are actually now placed on the brain itself. So there's no interfering hair, skin, skull, fluid, meninges, stuff, everything getting to the brain. Now you have an electrode right on the brain, and not only on the brain.
Well,
I
on
don't.
Parkinson's, it would be a specific spot.
We can talk about that too. I've seen those. Those are cool too. This is electrodes over the entire hemisphere.
Oh.
And so speech is a very complex action that requires integration of frontal areas, posterior areas, temporal areas, brainstem areas, and areas inside the middle of the brain. And so with electrode grids that could be on the brain without all that extra noise across the entire hemisphere, you can get signals that are much more directly related to speech output. And so what we've done is that we've determined what areas are doing what and what their timing is. And our next thing to do, actually, as soon as I'm done this, I'm going back to my office to hopefully hit submit on a grant, is to decode those signals directly from the brain into speech output of the articulators. So coming back to your question of, can you do this with consonants? You can't with the formants, but when you start modeling the articulators moving, now you get consonants and vowels for free. And those signals are much more directly related to the direct brain recording signals than the EEG signals themselves.
I mean, so is that 25, is that?
I'm hoping that's in 5 years because that's how long the grant is.
Oh, really?
The grant will be. Or maybe not 5 years, maybe 10 so I can get a renewal on it. But
My question, all right, what about sci-fi?
Yeah. So nobody wants to have half their skull removed and electrodes placed on their brain, right? Nobody wants that. We only do that in the most dire of circumstances. And some people will be in those dire circumstances where this is the only option, and we might be able to do something like that. So where does sci-fi come into this? Using these same techniques, well, there's two aspects of sci-fi, the good and the bad. The good is using these techniques and improving our signal acquisition capabilities to such an extent that recording from either the scalp or outside of the scalp entirely is as good as recording from the brain itself.
Oh, wow.
So that's the sci-fi part, because then you can use our techniques, and if we validate them in our research is good, we can just use those techniques and we can do all this stuff. People are already activating these vocal tract synthesizers using sensors on the face and other ways of tracking facial kinematics with motion capture.
Did you try different languages?
Pardon?
Different languages, foreign languages. Did you try?
Yeah. So we have
some
it.
of the easier.
Yeah. So we have it, but remember, I consider this as a motor thing. So this is language independent. Because all languages are separated by the linguistic component and the motor output. If you can still form your language and generate the motor command, then we can decode the motor command and generate the speech output. So in this way, this really is language independent, although we haven't specifically tested that. Different languages have different characteristics, so the formant frequency one is terrible for Spanish because Spanish vowels tend to move dramatically. There are very few steady state vowels. In English and German and Russian, I mean, no, not Russian, you have very steady vowels, so the formant synthesizer works well there. So that's the good sci-fi. The bad sci-fi is reading your thoughts, right? People ask about that all the time. We're not doing that, again, because we're reading the motor activations of the brain and doing motor output. But eventually somebody is going to read your thoughts, and then that's an issue. Like I said, I have a philosophy degree. I tend to think about that sometimes, but I know how far away we are from that, so I'm relatively comfortable. Yes?
Have you experimented with interferometry for this kind of remote sensing to not have to go into the brain?
Right. So there is some effort for using near-infrared spectrum. So you're not actually going inside of the brain itself, and you're not contacting the brain, the skull itself, but you're sending light signals in and coming back out again. But that's sort of the most remote type of sensing that's available. There's a lot of remote sensing techniques on the telemetry aspect of this, so making sensors that are on the head and inside of the head and wirelessly transmitting their recording, but you're still faced with the prospect of either having a craniotomy with electrodes inside your head or things on your scalp itself.
Yeah, actually what I'm talking about is relating, if you have multiple sensors attached to the scalp,
Sure.
using interferometry to try and pinpoint locations
Sure.
between them.
Sure. So, and we do that to some degree. So using like beamforming, right? So this would be one application, and we do that to improve the spatial resolution of the poor EEG signal. But again, you're still so they're good, right? And these are things that we do, and these are things that improve our ability to do our job. But they don't get us past the sensing problem itself, right? So that would be, if I had to predict, that's probably one of the ways we'll do this, is by reducing the at least numbers of sensors needed to make it a little bit more conspicuous or inconspicuous. But getting rid of sensors altogether or making them as hidden as possible is sort of where we want to go. So there are efforts for sensor-based tattoos, right? So or skin meshes. So these are the ways of the future for that, but they're a far way off from being useful.
Well, we're at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much. We
Sure
appreciate
thing.
it very much.
Thank you. I promise I do have more.